So it appears as if Antoine continues to have a couple of technical difficulties, so I'll step in for him. We're going to begin with a moment of silence. I'd like to bring us all to this presentation with a mindfulness activity. If you're able, sit back in your chair and be as comfortable as you possibly can. Follow your breath completely in and completely out. I want you to think of your community and breathe in what your community has been putting out, and breathe out what it is you believe that your community needs at this time. I want you to think of somebody in your life who's easy to love. Breathe in what that person has been putting out, and breathe out whatever it is you think that person needs. I'd like you to think of somebody in your life who's difficult to love. Maybe somebody who said something painful. I'd like you to breathe in what that person is putting out and exhale whatever it is you think that person needs right now. I want you to think of yourself in this moment. I want you to breathe in what you've been putting out and exhale whatever it is that you believe that you need right now. Thank you. So
thank you very much, Dr. Gottlieb, for welcoming and introducing us. My name is Antoine Craigwell, and I am the president and CEO of DBGM. I must apologize to all of you who've been waiting. I really hate this with a passion that we were supposed to start at 11 and we're now way past 11 because my laptop decided to do its own thing and behave in its own way on a Sunday morning. There are a couple of things that we'd like to ask you to keep in mind as what we call our community agreements. So we'd like to ask you to keep your microphones muted. If you need to ask a question in the chat box, you can actually ask a question there or raise your hand. We ask you not to take photos of the screen. We ask you to be respectful of everyone participating in this chat, in this forum, even if you disagree. And like I said just now, please use the chat box at the top, at the bottom here, if you need to ask a question. If it's a specific question for one of our presenters, please indicate who that presenter is. Or if it's a general question, then I will read the question and everybody will they will take a shot at answering it. And finally, we will share the slides and the recording with anyone who sends us a request. So our first presenter this morning is Dr. Audrey Osei, and she will talk with us about racism and mental health. Dr. Audrey Osei is a licensed clinical psychologist who received her doctorate from Long Island University Post Campus with a concentration in serious mental illness. Her research focused on examining how Black clinical and counseling psychology doctoral students experience navigating personal and professional relationships within their academic program. She was trained in both psychodynamic psychotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, which she uses in her virtual private and in-person practices located in Brooklyn, New York. Ladies and gentlemen, our community members, I'd like to welcome Dr. Audrey Osei. Dr. Osei.
Yes. So first, I just want to thank Risha and Antoine for bringing us together this early morning. I know many of us are not used to being up this morning, but it's great because I feel like we're here for a really important talk that's affecting communities of color. When I saw the overwhelming response of how many people had registered for this, it just reminded me how much we need these spaces to build community, to care for ourselves, and to come together that we've been doing historically, formally and informally throughout time. So I'm going to be talking today about racism, media, and how this affects our mental health. But before I start, I just want to talk about a little bit my reaction to the murder of George Floyd. Like many other instances of police brutality, I first heard about his murder through social media. The video was circulating around and there were many graphic descriptions. And based on what I was reading, I knew that I could not bear to watch this video. It reminded me not only of other videos that have circulated, thinking of Eric Garner and Philando Castile, but it also reminded me of stories that either never make it to mainstream media or that take longer. So I thought of Tony McDade and Breonna Taylor and other LGBT people in the community. And so even though it's not personally affecting me, I feel like as being a part of this community, we have this shared history. And so when we see these images, it's not only, you know, an assault on that person, it's an assault on our people. And so it just reminds us of so many generations of stories that we hear of our loved ones who've been targeted and harassed. And so I felt just a sense of weariness of kind of, here we go again. You know, how are they going to spin this master narrative? Despite having over 8 minutes of video footage, how are they going to suggest that he was somehow responsible for his murder? Were they going to say things like pre-existing conditions? You know, the more and more I thought about, just the more angry I felt, the more frustrated and the more sad. You know, were they going to come out with stories to somehow damage George Floyd's reputation, suggesting that maybe he smoked marijuana one time or he got a failing grade in a class? You know, how are they going to spin this to somehow say it was his fault? And so I just felt that, you know, over and over again. And even despite trying to avoid watching this video online, I still heard the audio while eating dinner and CNN was playing in the background. And so I can't even tell you how many times it felt within that hour when I was sitting at the dinner table that CNN replayed this over and over again, whether it's the audio, whether it's the video, whether it's still images. And despite not looking, I still heard "I Can't Breathe" and him crying for his mother playing in the back of my head. And then just thinking, I have to go to work now with these images revolving in my head, you know? And so it just really highlighted to me kind of this quote in which Malcolm X talks so much about the power of media and how they can make the innocent appear guilty and the guilty appear innocent. And we know kind of how they treat our stories. We know what happens when we're not in control of the narrative, and just how frustrating that is to see ourselves being dehumanized in the media. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about, you know, the impact of racism on our mental health, as well as how do we center our well-being when we're seeing deaths of Black people being routinely displayed in the media over and over again. I think it's important to talk about the impact of the media because it's so present in our lives. You know, from whether it's traditional forms of media, so this could be TV news, radio, newspapers, or whether it's social media, we're constantly being presented with new information over and over again. And so it plays a role not only in informing and communicating to us what's happening in the world. In some ways, they can be gatekeepers for the information that's brought into our awareness. And so I think it's kind of really important to think about that impact on us. You know, growing up, I remember seeing my family members often watching the news. I wonder, why are they watching the news 24/7? And now I feel like I'm that older Ghanaian auntie who's like telling my nephew, you know, call father remote control so I can watch the news. So it shows again how much it's a part of our lives. And so initially, I just want to talk about the ways in which racism can be categorized. So there's many ways racism can be categorized, but just thinking about the perspective of the media, we can think about it from an individual interpersonal level. So this would be individual acts of bias or stereotypes or generalizations that we might see about our communities. So you might think of like a broadcaster making an insensitive joke on social media, you know, and that backpedaling, you know, with an apology later on. You can also think about it as an institutional level. So this is when we're seeing certain like policies or practices or procedures within the institution that work to benefit white people. So you might think about like hiring practices that discriminate in one particular news department. You might think of the fact of like a social media board members that's only consisting of majority white board members versus people of color who are often using these apps as well. You can also think about it at like a structural level. So this is when we're seeing policies or programs at differing institutions that lead to kind of adverse outcomes for people of color. So an example you might think of is kind of issues around censoring hate speech. So we're often noticing that a lot of accounts of people of color and Black activists tend to be muted. Oh, someone's asking about slides. So I don't have slides. You're just gonna have to look at my face for this whole time. And so hopefully that's okay. So there's no slides, but I will give people my contact information later if you want some of these references or articles and things like that. And so am I showing up as like the big picture? I just wanna make sure, because I don't know, we wanna keep the bio up or is this fine? Okay, okay, I'm gonna assume it's fine, okay. And so again, at a structural level is you might think of the fact of someone's asking if we can make it big. I don't know if that's possible. If we can, if it's possible, maybe that'll help. Okay, so am I showing? Okay. And so when we think about kind of, again, at a structural level, just to go back, that's the kind of inconsistency that we see around hate speech. So there was an article that was just talking about a lot of Black activists who are often being muted compared to other forms of things that don't get muted. And so even my friend was telling me the other day how she logged into Facebook and saw an image of a white person reenacting a modern day lynching. And so that's something that's completely, you know, not censored. So there's something there structural, you know, that's going on. And so just thinking about, you know, positive aspects of traditional forms of media. So news, radio, and newspapers, they provide a central role in informing the public of what is going on. So they are definitely needed because they allow us to, you know, stay connected and keep ourselves informed. Similarly with social media, this is a place where we get a lot of our news. We can stay connected with people. We can promote causes. It can be an outlet for creativity, self-expression, and again, it's valuable for information and learning. But I think where the issue comes in with traditional forms of media is there's this kind of false belief that they're somehow neutral and that they're somehow apolitical. You know, their hashtag could be things like, we're just reporting the facts. And again, this is despite the fact that they can really shape public opinion. So when we think about the exonerated 5 who were falsely accused of raping a woman in Central Park, a lot of traditional, you know, newspapers were referring to them as a wolf pack, you know, as they were reporting this, you know, throughout the court case. And so that definitely shapes the way that they were viewed, you know, within the public eye. I think the other thing with social media is there's kind of this sense that, you know, I'm just expressing my opinion, that we don't necessarily have to think about the consequences of what we're saying in a public space. Also in some sites where there's maybe a lot more anonymity, people can feel that they can say things, you know, on social media that they wouldn't normally say to your face. I think there can also be this sense of kind of familiarity. So even with relative strangers, people might feel that they can know someone better than they do. They can ask for things, but maybe again, they wouldn't necessarily ask for in an offline space. And so I think this kind of leads to people being less respectful of each other's boundaries. And so just thinking about, you know, racial bias, you know, there's been a long history of racial bias, you know, within the media, which I was referring to before. And we see this in so many different levels. So one, there's often been this history of kind of excluding people of color from positions of power. So this leads to a lot of stereotyping and misinterpreting when it comes to reporting about, people of color. We also look at media ownership. There's these large giant firms, that own multiple news stations and all kind of forms of media. So you think of things like Warner Media, which I believe owns CNN. You think about the Murdoch family and what's their agenda. They own Fox News. Again, so this creates an issue kind of, these are the people who, again, are holding the purse strings. So how much are they shaping around what's allowed to be reported and how it's reported and who is reporting it to us? The other thing to note is that a recent survey showed that in US newsrooms, people of color only represent 22% of the workforce. And so can you imagine only 22% of that workforce is a diverse group of people. And so what does this lead to? It leads to that topics that relate to minority groups are often excluded. There's only focusing on a standard list of stereotypes. It could even lead to journalists being less trained in being able to provide balanced coverage within a multicultural society. And so that can lead to kind of a biased depiction of racial groups. So for example, there's this association between Black people and criminality. I saw a study saying that Black people were 4 times more likely to be portrayed as criminals within the media compared to other professions. And so when you think about how things are shown, so when you have like a Black suspect or who has committed a crime, they're more likely to show unflattering photos, mug shots, the person's more likely to be featured in handcuffs, versus how, versus how white people are shown in the media when they commit crimes. So even when we think about the coverage around Hurricane Katrina, it felt anytime you saw a Black person trying to get supplies or a person of color, they were portrayed as looters. Versus when it was a white person, they're just trying to find supplies. So there's a different way of kind of, referencing, and how they're shown. Like who's shown now with the protesting? Who's more likely to be shown when it's referred to as a peaceful protest versus when it's suggested that it's like a riot? Who more likely is to be shown, during those times? The other thing is, in line with this failure of a goal of neutrality, like I was saying before, Black people are again more likely to be presented as criminals. The other thing I was thinking about is just when we think about like perpetrators of violence, when you see, for example, like a white person or a white male who's been like a mass murderer, it feels that we get the whole, backstory. They were a lone wolf. We all of a sudden learn about everything they did in grade school, versus when it's a person of color, they're just reduced down to their crime. You get no context, you get no background about who this person was or any understanding of who they were. And again, this is not exclusive to one company. We see it at a really structural level, similar like how I mentioned with the exonerated 5. And so, when I came to thinking about what effect does this have on us? What effect does this have on us as people of color to routinely see ourselves portrayed in the media this way? How does it affect us when we see, people in our community being murdered and those images being displayed over and over? And I came across an interesting article, which was in US Today, and it was talking about racial violence. And the headline was, when is the last time you saw a white person killed online? And I sat there and it just struck me. I couldn't think of not one example. I could not think of one video, one image that has been shown over and over again, compared to the ways in which Black people and people of color, when we've been murdered, the way that information is shared over and over again. And so it just kind of really, struck me and thinking about how does that affect us witnessing this? Even if it's not happening to us, like how is this affecting us by witnessing this? And so I've seen some people kind of referring to the sharing, of these images, or sharing these videos, and referring to it as like trauma porn, or pain porn, and it really brings up what's the motivation behind sharing these kind of images. Sometimes, when these images are shared, I barely remember if there's any kind of trigger warning. Is there anything letting us know that this is something that might be graphic so that we can prepare ourselves? Sometimes these videos are shared with a kind of feigned shock. I can't believe this is happening in America. people need to see this. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what America, like, did you grow up in? You know, this is something we know. This is something we've seen, you know, over and over again. This is something that, you know, may have happened to us. It reminded me of, before I had to go to work, I was in the morning, and so I usually put CNN on the background. And there was a pool party. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I think it was predominantly like Black teenagers, you know, at this pool party. And I guess someone had called the police. And I just remember this police officer threw a teenage girl down to the floor and put his knee in her back. And again, I just remember CNN like playing this over and over and thinking to myself, like, I have to go to work after this, you know, and, you know, I can't call work and say, you know, I'm triggered. Like, I have to go to work, and just seeing them play that over and over again, it felt so, you know, awful to kind of to have to hold that and then to go about the day as if nothing's wrong. And so sometimes I think with social media, there's a sense that kind of showing these images and displaying them is somehow, you know, spreading awareness. You know, there's maybe a belief that this can, you know, lead to change. So I do, you know, want to acknowledge that sometimes, you know, this is how we learn about these stories. And I think sometimes people might think of it in line with, you know, the murder of Emmett Till and how his mother, you know, advocated for having an open casket. And so I think there's that side of it. But I think we also have to think about, you know, the effects that it has on us and what's your intention in sharing, you know, this information and thinking about ourselves. Are we in a space where we can take in this kind of information? Because I think what happens is that we get, you know, dehumanized. They dehumanize us. You know, I was watching Trial by Media on Netflix the other night, and I was watching the episode that was on the murder of Amadou Diallo. And there was a reporter who was talking about how he was reduced kind of to 41 shots. Man shot 41 shots. Or it was like immigrant shot 41 shots. So they referred to him as a street peddler. And there was just no mention or sense of that. This is like a fully human being. He's not only his death. He's not only 41 shots. You know, similarly with Eric Garner, it's I can't breathe. I can't breathe. And I do think that, you know, these become important slogans that are used during protests, you know, so I do want to highlight that. But I think, you know, within like the media, it kind of reduces that person to the only thing that we're going to learn about them is how, you know, they died. And so in thinking about kind of the racism that we see in media and thinking about how it affects our mental health, racism has a cumulative effect. So when we're witnessing these things, we're not only responding to it as isolated incidents, we're responding to our own personal traumas that it can bring up. We're responding to historical trauma. We're responding to, you know, traumas that we've either heard about or witnessed. And so, you know, George Floyd is among, you know, many, you know, other people who have experienced, you know, police brutality, who have been murdered. And so when we see these things, you know, we're responding to all of that it can bring up. The other thing to note is that racism can affect, you know, our mental health from early as childhood. You know, I think there's this kind of false belief that somehow children are colorblind, you know, and that, you know, they don't recognize, you know, racism. You know, people might avoid talking to their children about racism. But even, you know, preschoolers begin to kind of group themselves by race. And even by the age of 10, you know, a child can recognize obvious and even subtle signs of racial discrimination. Also to note is that, you know, people of color experience post-traumatic stress syndrome at a higher rate. And so that's just another reflection, you know, of how, you know, racism contributes to that. And so when I think about kind of what can capture maybe some of what all of us are feeling, and I definitely know that I'm feeling, is there's this term that was coined by a critical race theorist, I believe William Smith, and it referred to this idea of racial battle fatigue. And so I'll say that again, racial battle fatigue. And so initially it was referencing kind of for African-American men in America to describe what happens, you know, through negative and racially charged experiences. But now it's, you know, it's been brought in to reference all of us. And so it's talking about kind of the stress that we can experience, you know, with race-related encounters. What happens when we're continually facing like dismissive, demeaning, insensitive, or hostile racial environments. And I include, the media within that. I include that, I feel like, as an environment where we're experiencing, stereotypes, where we're experiencing, discrimination. And so what can stem from that is it can affect you physically, to the point where people can have headaches. You might find yourself getting sick more often, elevated blood pressure, finding yourself feeling trembly or jumpy. And it can also affect our mood. So feelings of depression or anxiety, noticing yourself having more trouble concentrating or speaking, coherently. Even for myself, I've noticed, within the last few weeks, that I have just had like disrupted sleep. I've noticed myself kind of overeating and snacking and being like, I'm not hungry. Why am I going back to the kitchen? And just kind of having like repeated thoughts about this throughout the day when I'm not wanting to think about it. Even finding myself feeling, tearful throughout the day. So it really shows that there's an effect that happens to us when we're watching these videos of police brutality. And that's affecting us not only physically, but it's affecting us mentally, and emotionally. And so I just wanted to think about kind of how do we center our well-being? How do we kind of care for ourselves, during this time, and going forward, because we know that this is going to be, ongoing discrimination and marginalization. We know that this is not a period of time. This is something that's going to continue and has been, happening in the past. And I have to be honest, like I really struggled with thinking about how do I talk about, coping? Because there's a part of me that we know that all these forms of media are going to continue to kind of use our pain in a way, whether it's for their own ratings, for their own entertainment, what have you. And it just made me think of kind of how I've been struggling right now. How as a therapist am I trying to, hold space for clients? Like, how am I trying to be present, within significant relationships? Because like I've said, I've found myself having trouble concentrating, having trouble, finding words. And then I worried, if I talk about ways about coping, am I minimizing like the deep wounds of our pain? Am I like negating and somehow like our valid reactions, like our valid anger, our valid, frustration, sadness, the reasons that people are protesting? I know that, so many of you are out there doing resistance work and protesting in many different forms. So I worried if I talked about coping, am I minimizing, what we're going through? And so I really had to kind of think about, even, generations before us, even like our ancestors before, took time to rest at some point. When they were fighting, when they were existing, they took, rest at some point. They had to take, time away, to recharge themselves. And so I tried to think of it from that perspective. So I just wanted to kind of share just some suggestions about kind of ways of coping, with the media, what we're seeing in the media. And so my approach was just to think about, the fact that no, I'm not okay. And I don't have to act like I'm okay. It's okay to acknowledge, that I'm not okay. And, as a Ghanaian, it feels weird for me to, when someone asks me, we kind of always respond like, I'm good, I'm fine. It's impolite to say that you're not doing well. And so I've just started saying I'm managing, being just honest with myself, like I'm managing, that's what I'm doing right now. There's some days I feel like I'm managing better. And then there's other days where it feels more difficult. And so I think it's, we need to kind of make room for those distressing feelings that are coming up for us, or those distressing thoughts. We need to acknowledge them. We need to accept them and know that they're a natural reaction, to the trauma that we're witnessing, that we're experiencing. And so kind of given that, I really liked, within the initial email and the flyer, there was a quote where Audrey Lorde talks about self-care. That the fact that this is an act of, political warfare, and that there is value, in caring for ourselves, and that caring for ourselves and continuing to exist is, a form of resistance. And so just some things to keep in mind is thinking about kind of having boundaries around how much media you're consuming. Thinking about, okay, how often do I want to be informed? Because a lot of this information, these stories are kind of played out throughout the day. So at some point, you're going to get the information. So I think sometimes we have this feeling that we're going to miss out, or that we need to kind of constantly be checking in. And so it can kind of be hard to think about where do I establish a boundary, you know? And so I just recommend kind of checking in with yourself. Like I've been dividing things up for myself into what am I thinking? How am I feeling? What are my behaviors? How am I responding? And just kind of noticing, when I'm consuming the media, how am I feeling throughout the day, and kind of just doing that check-in with myself. Like again, dividing it between like, what am I thinking? How am I feeling? My behaviors, how am I responding to the content that I'm taking in? And then also just noticing any changes. Are you finding yourself feeling more persistently sad than usual? Are you feeling more anxious? Are you noticing any changes like in your sleep or eating? These are things to kind of help you to keep in mind, and maybe when you're taking in things that are too much for you right now. And so some type of boundaries could be kind of time of day, maybe picking particular times of the day when you choose to either check social media or check the news. For me, I found that's helpful to kind of watch at the end of the day. I feel like I'm getting a summary. For some people, that might be a little bit more difficult watching at the end of the day, especially when you're trying to go to sleep. So maybe watching things earlier and having a cutoff time. The other thing I've been thinking about is kind of how long. So with social media, I knew it wasn't going to be realistic that I would like delete the app and not go on. And so I said to myself, I'm going to limit the amount of time. So before, where I'd be scrolling and scrolling, I try to just go on for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then, kind of move on and do something else. I think it can also be helpful to kind of schedule do not disturb time. So just picking time where you can mindfully engage in something else. Whatever that else thing is, whatever that is, just giving yourself time where you can, not be disturbed. Also, I think we need to be mindful of what we're sharing. And so if you're choosing to share some of these things, you can, put trigger warnings. Maybe you don't share it with your whole group of people. Maybe you designate certain people or group that you want to share it to. If someone is sharing you a lot of like videos or things like that, maybe having a conversation with that person. I'll be honest with you, I do not watch about 99.9% of the videos that are sent to me on WhatsApp. I choose not to click on them. I do not know what they might be. And so I have decided just not to watch any of those. And so those are some things that you can kind of keep in mind. The other thing is, I think just, understanding that any distressing, emotions or any distressing experiences, again, like a valid, response, to trauma. And I know later on the talk, there's going to be more discussion about trauma, so I'm not going to go too much into that. The other thing is just thinking about kind of supportive people or supportive spaces where you can talk about what you're experiencing, and kind of having spaces in which you feel like you can challenge racism, where you can feel affirmed, and developing some of those spaces maybe offline where you can talk to people about that. And then lastly, I think, during those times, it can be hard to think about, having moments of joy. Things are, very heavy. Again, this is not something new. This has been going on, we know, for many, many, generations. And so I think it can be hard to sometimes allow ourselves to experience that joy. And thinking about kind of the dehumanization that I was talking about earlier, I think it's really important to consume media that's celebratory of us and our communities. I think it's really important to just highlight, our diversity, our creativity. That is something that, centers us, that grounds us. And so I think it is okay to give yourself time to consume other types of media. For myself, like I've been watching, a lot of films by Black directors. After this, I'm going to do a marathon of a show that I like, Noah's Ark. And so, take time to also give space to these things, because I think it's important. And so I also sometimes keep photos of artwork that I like, or, smiling, Black people. So I have this great photo of Grace Jones, love it. And so I kind of just want to end there with, just knowing that our ancestors resisted and they existed and they took care of ourselves, and let's kind of continue that tradition for ourselves as well. And so thank you, everybody, for allowing me to have this time, this space to speak with all of you.
Thank you very much, Adjoa, Dr. Osei. This is really great. This is really fantastic. I think one of the things that we can take away from what you were saying just now is that you placed all of some of our experiences that we've been having in context. and how the media really does influence how we think. And one of the things that I heard you mention, which we often don't think about, is that even though we may see our presenters and our journalists are Black or people of color, it is the owners of these media outlets that are white that then drive the messaging that we get. And we often forget that in fact, it's the white community that dictates what kind of messaging we get. And they try to tell us, in fact, how we must think, how we must view people. And I'm also really and truly appreciative of the fact that you talk about the coping mechanisms that people need to look at and work with, including, not looking at too much news because it's all repetitive, it's all cyclical, and they just spin the same thing in a different way, but it's communicating a specific narrative. And that begins to inveigle its way into our consciousness and affect, and as I'm seeing a number of people are commenting, how triggered and affected they are. Just briefly before we move on to the next presenter, Kevin, who celebrates that he's glad that there's another Ghanaian in the house, said that he would like you to touch on racism's effect on white people, not necessarily to center whiteness, but curious about your thoughts. He says he refers to the pedagogy of the oppressed, touches on the idea of the oppressor lacking the inherent humanity they claim to have preeminence over. A healthy self-esteem, a healthy self-construct is understanding that you are no better or worse than someone, but the same. So he's asking, how does the idea of racial bias, prejudice, or interpersonal racism adversely impact people who are part of the global minority, white folk? And he says, I often think about how ultimately we unfortunately need white people on this journey for justice with us, not just for us, but also for them to be more whole, more human, if you will. Any thoughts?
Sure, and that's a great question. In my presentation, I did choose to center, people of color. That felt like my priority to speak to that now. But I think really great work, and she has a lot of videos on YouTube, is Dr. DeGroy talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome. She talks about it not only the effect on, yes, Risha, I saw that. She talks about it not only on the effect of, Black people and people of color, but one thing she refers to as far as kind of white people is this kind of disconnect. And so instead of being able to hold these conflicting beliefs about the ways in which they were treating us, it's more that they kind of have to, change the belief. It talks about the dehumanization. And so I would definitely, refer to that. I think she does a really, great summary in talking about, how racism affects white people as well.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Osei. Our next presenter is Kitama Cahill Jackson. Kitama Cahill Jackson comes from a family of activists and sees his role as a licensed social worker and a staff therapist at New Perspective Psychological Services as a natural extension of his family's commitment to the community, advocacy, and involvement. He received his master's in social work from Columbia University, where he entered into their specialized DBT program with behavioral tech, Marsha Linehan's Training Institute. He is passionate about making DBT responsive and accessible to communities of color as he seeks to contribute to healthy individuals, families, and communities. Kitama is adept at exploring issues pertaining to masculinity, racial identity, and trauma. Prior to becoming a therapist, he was a documentary filmmaker and journalist who worked on films such as Harry Belafonte's Sing Your Song, Stonewall Uprising, The Central Park Five, and Pete Seeger, The Power of Song. He's a member of the board of advisors for Rocking Boat, a youth development organization in the South Bronx, and the Rosenberg Fund for Children, a nonprofit providing financial support to the children of political prisoners. I'd like us all to welcome Kitama to talk with us about systemic inequalities and the impact on mental health. Kitama.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm here today as a therapist, as a half Black, half white man who was really raised by a large extended family of activists who included my grandfather, Pete Seeger, who was a white man, folk singer who was involved in the civil rights movement. I'm here today to talk about systemic equality in mental health and the importance of not just looking at mental health as mental health, but the importance of digging deeper and looking at all of the systems that play a role in this. So first, what is systemic inequality? It is when a society is engineered in such a way to privilege certain groups while putting other groups at a disadvantage. So take a look at this slide. When you see equality, not everyone is given the same opportunity. And when we look at inequality, we see how some people are given tremendous amount of opportunity, while some people are held so far back, that they're literally like this child in a hole. I'd like to give you an example that's one of my favorite examples. So I want you to imagine, when we talk about invalidation today, I would like to imagine I hand you a lemon. You take a bite out of this lemon and you feel just like this little girl in the slide. It is so sour that your whole face looks just like hers. So sour. And I tell you, what's the matter with you? What's the matter with your taste buds that you can't even eat a lemon? Me, all my friends, my entire community, everyone I know could just pop lemons into their mouth like they're eating peanuts. So there's something wrong with you. So this child's going to go through life feeling like there's something wrong with them. That's how invalidation starts. And it makes us question ourselves. So how is this connected to mental health? Systemic inequality causes a person to feel invalidated, and this invalidation can create mental health disorders, such as depression, anxiety, or PTSD. So before I became a therapist, I was a documentary filmmaker. I'd like to share this story of how systemic oppression made a role in my life. So I was loading my car for a film shoot, like I'd done many times. I pulled up my car in front of my building, and I opened up the trunk and started loading in equipment, when suddenly a van of 8 police officers got out, surrounded me, started questioning me. Who was I? What was I doing? Where did I live? What's in my car? All of these different questions, right? And suddenly, going through my mind, I'm thinking, what did I do? I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't believe I double parked. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm leaving this late. Oh my God, what can I say? What can I do? At no point in that time am I thinking they're stopping me because I'm Black. So when you're invalidated by a system, it becomes more complicated. I saw myself as a documentary filmmaker who had double parked in front of his own building. The police saw a situation that warranted 8 police officers to come question me for 15 minutes. I also found a picture of the car that I was driving. So if I'd been white, here are the things that would have been different, and these things are entirely based on the system. First, one of the reasons that they did find in this entire situation was when they were running my license, they learned that I had a temporarily suspended license for an unpaid speeding ticket that I totally forgot to mail in. So if I had been white, I probably wouldn't have gotten that speeding ticket in the first place, and then wouldn't have, and as a result, wouldn't have had a temporarily suspended license. And I probably wouldn't have been stopped, questioned, and treated as a criminal for loading my car while double parked. I probably wouldn't have had an interaction that made me wonder if I was going to be beat up or shot. And I probably wouldn't have been told how lucky I was for not being arrested. It wasn't until preparing for this presentation, 13 years after this happened, that I learned the fine for having a suspended license is only $200 to $500, and they couldn't have arrested me for it in the first place. So how does invalidation affect you? Invalidating experiences affect everyone differently. For me, it used to make me feel anxious around police and feel that I was lucky this time and that I could have been easily hurt or arrested. My anxieties affected my work, where I become anxious if I need to call the police in an emergency. Or when a police enters my subway car, I look down with the hopes that he will get off at the next stop. I am always concerned that the worst possible thing could happen, and I do whatever I can to make it not happen, which generally means I avoid contact. So invalidation can lead to mental health diagnoses. While invalidation caused anxiety for me, some may display symptoms of depression, such as self-isolation and feeling unworthy, while others will blame yourself and vividly remember these situations on a regular basis, which is a trauma response. So each one of these changes how we see things. And now we must figure out how to accept and validate a situation once we see kind of how it leads to mental health. First, we must accept this reality. I need to accept I did not do anything to warrant being stopped by being stopped and questioned by the police. I must accept and acknowledge the existence of my problematic thoughts and not accept them as facts. Blaming myself for being too lazy and nervous to carry my experience, to carry my heavy, expensive equipment to my car, judging myself for not leaving earlier in the day, to avoid loading my car at night, and being angry at myself for forgetting to pay a speeding ticket. So once you've accepted the situation for what it is, instead of blaming myself for being too anxious and nervous, the way to actually say it, I was being cautious by not wanting my equipment to get broken or stolen by lugging it 3 blocks through Harlem late at night. It's not my fault that the police questioned me. Instead of judging myself for not leaving earlier in the day to avoid loading my car at night, I could say to myself, I was being responsible by getting to the location the night before, so I'm well rested and ready for the film shoot. Instead of being angry at myself for getting to pay a speeding ticket, I could say, and I should say, I've been so busy with work, paying that speeding ticket slipped my mind. So validation, it's easier said than done. So these are 6 steps from validation from Marsha Linehan's DBT training manual, which I work out of as a therapist. First, when you're self-validating, validating yourself, describe your experience. Describe what actually happened. What was your point of view in it? 2, accept where you were wrong. Yeah, I should have paid that parking ticket. Determine where you are correct and stand up for yourself if possible, even if it's only to yourself. While maybe I should have paid that parking ticket, I didn't do anything to deserve to be stopped and questioned by the police. Accept that being invalidated hurts and allow yourself to feel the pain. Identify the mistakes and remind you that we are all human. Have compassion for yourself. Understand why what occurred happened. I was questioned for being double parked because I was Black. Next, I would like to show you some ways that you can care for yourself in today's world. These are some things that work for me, and I encourage you to add them to your own lists. At this time, I would like to thank everyone for inviting me here, all of you coming, and most importantly, I would like to thank the people who are on the front lines for this protest. You're doing incredible, incredible work, and you're making history in a positive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Kitama. I just want to go back here. One of the things that came up while you were talking is that earlier this morning, Joy Reid on her show showed some images that in fact white people have used the police as their tool to enforce their racism in practical ways, which goes back all the way back to slavery. And she was showing different pictures and images of police, how the police utilize and brutalize Black bodies. And one of the things that also come to mind is that back in 2017, Sir Hilary Beckles, who's the Vice Chancellor for University of West Indies, he said in a Black History Month event that in 2015, the installment on the loan they had borrowed from the Rothschild Bank to pay the white plantation owners in the colonies for the abolition of slavery. So between 1832 and 2015, as far as the British government was concerned, Black people were property, were still considered property. And we see the correlation or the parallel in the United States where Black people are continually seen as property. And that is why police are consistently using and beating Black people, because as the prominent gynecologist who operated on Black people without anesthesia said was that Black people don't feel pain. They're not human. So thank you very much for bringing that again to our attention.
Thank you.
So our next presenter is Cynthia Cabral, Dr. Cynthia Cabral. And she's a licensed clinical psychologist and a clinical director at Promoting Resilience, Intersectionality, Diversity, and Equity Research Consortium, affiliated with Hunter College. She received her doctoral degree from St. John's University, where her research fellowship focused on the assessment and treatment of trauma in racial ethnic minority communities throughout Western Queens. She developed expertise in trauma-informed care and an understanding of the relationship between identity development, trauma, and health outcomes. Currently, Dr. Cabral supports the research teams and principal investigators by training and supervising a diverse team of interventionists in the delivery of motivational interviewing-based behavioral interventions designed to reduce HIV transmission rates in adolescent and young adult men who have sex with men. She had an active role in the development of a motivational interviewing and intervention module targeting HIV transmission and substance use in transgender and gender-expansive young adults. Community members, I'd like to welcome Dr. Cabral. Dr. Cabral.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to thank everyone who is joining us today. So I am here today as Cynthia. I am here today as a Latinx woman and therapist who stands in solidarity with her Black brothers and sisters in this struggle. I'm going to talk about police violence, vicarious trauma, and mental health across the lifespan, and I am getting emotional as I get ready to talk about it. And I don't think any of my feelings are unique. As previous presenters have said, thank you, Audrey and Kitama, we've been sad, angry, frustrated. I think it's important to name that this is all happening in the context of COVID-19, which is an illness that is disproportionately affecting Black and brown humans at this time, right? So, you know, as we were sheltering in place and doing all of that stuff, when these videos of police brutality and violence against George Floyd and others started to come up, I thought, well, shit, you know, haven't we dealt with enough at this particular moment? And why is this happening again? So what I wanted to do today is do what I try to do as a clinician and a mental health provider, which is talk about trauma, talk about what it is, talk about signs and symptoms of trauma, and then, you know, briefly address some ways that, you know, we can sort of manage these things as they come up. Okay, so as Audrey already talked about in her presentation, right, you know, images and videos of police brutality and violence are everywhere. You cannot escape them if you are a person in this world who, you know, watches TV or participates in social media in any kind of way. And you could argue that there are good things and bad things about this, right? Without the video evidence of George Floyd being murdered by police, we might not know the name George Floyd at this moment, which is mind-boggling to think about. And it is very unlikely that his murderer and those complicit in his murder would have been arrested, right? And we wouldn't have the movement that we currently have. We are in the middle of the second wave of the civil rights movement, right? So those, we can sort of celebrate those as positive things, that justice is, well, I'm not gonna say being met because we don't know yet, but there are steps in the right direction, right? But as Audrey again pointed out in her talk, this means that these violent images are being circulated over and over again. And if you're just, you know, trying to scroll on Instagram, you know, to see some cute pictures of cats, guilty of that, you might see the same graphic video 30 times, 40 times, right? I'm like now revealing how much I scroll, right? Thank you. All right, so I wanted to talk about this idea of linked fate. This is something I came across when I was putting together this talk. And as a way of explaining why these videos and these images are so hurtful for Black individuals and POC individuals, right? So there's this theory called linked fate, that for the African-American community in particular, an individual perceives their life to be tied to the race as a whole. And so when Black people see these violent images and videos, right, they identify with the victims. This is very personal for Black and brown folks. We see ourselves in these images. We don't have the privilege of turning away from them in the same way that a white person would. Okay, so what is the impact on all of this? And I think just from our presenters, we've started to hear, and so this is, you know, we're gonna do a little more of a deep dive, right? So the scant research that exists, there was not as much as I would like there to be, shows that, you know, which would come as a surprise to no one, there's like a bunch of mental health adverse reactions that can come from seeing these violent videos and images, right? We internalize the message that we're more likely to have a foreshortened future, and for Black individuals in particular, that their lives are less valuable. Again, to Audrey's point, think about if you've ever seen a video of a white person being murdered, and it's just so common for Black individuals, right? And then it's not just the actual image or the actual video itself. There's other sort of pieces to this, right? Comments posted underneath, right? We're not supposed to read comments, right? We're just not. I have to admit, I'm guilty of reading them sometimes. And, you know, the comments can be racist comments. They can sort of justify why something happened to a Black person, you know, framing it as, well, they were doing something to deserve this, or, you know, assume Black guilt, which is something that happens all the time. And as Audrey again pointed out, sort of those comments begin to tell a narrative of why this person deserved what happened to them, right? And then, as we know, what happens over and over again when white police officers are inevitably not convicted of the crimes that they are charged with, it again sends this message that Black lives are not valuable and that they actually don't matter. Next slide, please. Okay. So wait, going back, what is secondary trauma? Thank you. All right. So, so a secondary trauma just means that the traumatic event isn't something that happens to you directly. Okay. Right now in the field of psychology, secondary trauma is only understood to be traumatic events that you directly witnessed with your own eyes, or that somebody told you about in a lot of detail. I'm gonna put the mental health community on blast for a second, because that is not an adequate definition. The research is actually starting to tell us that viewing these violent images of police brutality, or even just like reading about them in the newspaper, or a blog post, or, you know, whatever, BuzzFeed News, right, can result in symptoms that look like primary trauma symptoms. And so again, you know, something I want to say throughout is that we're just sort of beginning to understand and study this, right? Thank you. So what does secondary trauma look like? This is a very scary and detailed slide, right? There are a whole host of symptoms here. And this is not even an exhaustive list, y'all. I had to condense for time. I want audience members to sort of look at this list and sort of see what symptoms resonate with them. Some of our presenters have started to talk about what this looks like. This is like a sort of like Chipotle menu, in that if you have 4 people living in a house, there can be 4 completely different trauma presentations. You know, pick your own adventure kind of thing, right? So some that I want to highlight are that secondary trauma can actually result in a weakened immune system, which again is sort of frightening to think about in the era of COVID, which again is disproportionately affecting Black and brown folks, right? So all the more reason that we need to sort of self-care and you know, preserve our bodies to the best of our ability, right? Another sort of symptom that can come up is isolating, right? And again, we're currently being tasked with isolating as much as possible because of COVID, but you know, even just, and I'm guilty of this too, just like not having the energy to text somebody back. Like I just cannot, right? And so even isolating more than is required to, when what we do know is that actually connecting is one of the ways to guard against traumatic symptoms, right? Another one I want to highlight here is hypervigilance, right? Hypervigilance is, you know, when we keep our guard up, we're expecting the next bad thing to happen, the next bad thing, always being aware. And one version this can take is like having difficulty disconnecting from TV, the news, social media. I know I'm very guilty of this. You know, if I don't check Twitter for a couple of hours, I'm like, but what's happening? Because I need to know. And I'm conceptualizing that as a form of hypervigilance and emphasizing that it's okay to step away. You know, Depersonalization is just like when you're kind of spaced out, you feel kind of numb. And Audrey brought this up too, that intrusive re-experiencing, that you're like trying to do your job or like, be with your partner or whatever. And you just can't, you can't focus because you've got these images and these videos like playing in your mind, or even these like offensive tweets, right, that are sent out. On this list is feeling more sensitive. Gee, I am the poster child for this, as I like got tearful at the beginning of this presentation, right? So what does the research tell us about vicarious trauma, right? As you guys can see, POC reports several different types of coping strategies and also just wanting to talk to other POC about the experiences. I want to highlight avoidance here. The mental health community can sometimes like unintentionally stigmatize avoidance because avoidance is actually a core trauma symptom. So, the idea is like, oh, you want to heal from trauma, so you want to get rid of the avoidance. But actually what we're finding is that, for POC in particular, avoidance might actually be very helpful. And, we can think about that when we think about, stepping away from the social media, stepping away from the news, taking some time to unplug, and disconnect, that can actually be very adaptive and helpful and give you sort of strength to live your life, and fight the fight, right? Okay, so I wanted to touch on secondary traumatic stress and children, right? The scant research we do have, again, tells us that, children being exposed to these violent images or traumatic images can have a negative impact on them. This does look a little different depending on the age of the child. Okay, again, another very scary, exhaustive list here, or not, actually it is not exhaustive. So when thinking about trauma symptoms in children, it is important to keep in mind that they, especially younger children, may not be able to articulate the feelings that they have around what's going on, right? We have to bridge the gap for them by asking them how they feel, asking them to label their feelings and what's scary for them, for sure. And then conversations with preschool and elementary school children, should really emphasize the positive steps that are being taken to address systemic racism. We don't want to totally shield them from the truth, but we also want to do a Barack Obama and provide hope, right? It's important to limit and monitor screen time to the extent it's possible, right? Like, good luck getting a 17-year-old away from their phone. But, especially with younger children, there isn't a need to see all of these images. Okay, so the trauma-body connection, and again, Audrey, talked about this in her presentation by, talking about all of the ways that sort of trauma shows up, right? So I thought that this was really important to highlight. Again, think of all of the physical symptoms. I had a whole column of them associated with trauma. When we're faced with something really scary in our world, right, the fight or flight response is triggered. And the fight or flight response is actually good in that it keeps us alive. If there is a bear in your way, your body reacts in such a way that gets you to run away as fast as possible from that bear. It's an adaptive response, but it's only meant to be temporary. It is only meant to be temporary. Having this response triggered constantly, which is what happens when you are a Black or brown person in this world, has long-term mental health consequences and physical consequences for sure. And likely it's what accounts for some of the health disparities that we see between white people and then Black and brown people. In putting this talk together, it became really salient for me how the psychiatric understanding of trauma is actually predicated on the idea that the world is safe most of the time. And that traumatic events are isolated incidents, and that's just not true for Black and brown, and particularly Black people in this world. what happens when you can't legitimately claim safety in any situation? We think of Breonna Taylor, who was like literally in her house, the place where you're supposed to take your bra off and hang out, right? You can't claim to be safe there. Thank you. All right, again, Kitama and Adjoa have sort of talked about, you know, ways to self-care in this time, right? I wanted to try a way to summarize all of the sort of suggestions that I had for that. And then I came across this really, really great idea of, you know, the 4 bodies as applied to racial trauma. And I've included the link to this, and so you folks will have access to this if you want to. And so this just talks about the idea of like the 4 bodies, right? The mental, body, emotional, physical, and spiritual, and that we actually have to attend to all of these in order to, you know, really thoroughly enact a self-care practice. And I'm using the word practice very deliberately because I think this is very much a lifelong journey as a POC, right? To attend to yourself in all these different ways. I will share with all of you something that I recommend to the you know, survivors of violence who were adolescents that I have worked with in the past, which is the 5-minute dance party, which is quite literally putting on some of your favorite songs. It could go longer. It could be a 10, 15-minute, 20-minute dance party. Sometimes I made them do it with me and they were like awkward and embarrassed about it. So I was like, okay, let's do 2 songs, right? And the point of that is to move your body as much as possible and sing along and get wild and boogie down. And in doing so, you actually potentially address these 4 bodies as a way to let go of the tension that you're literally holding on to, right? Staring at the phone, right? So I invite all of you, you know, as you're going about your days and your lives after this presentation, to enact 5-minute or 10-minute dance party. Join some of those like Facebook Live DJ, no, Instagram Live DJ things. I don't even know what's going on. I'm too old. But so dance and singing as an act of liberation. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So closing thoughts, and again, I think Adjoa said some of this beautifully, right? Feel your feelings. Be all in your feelings. Don't operate at 100%. We live in a capitalistic society that sort of demands that we perform constantly at 150%, and you are all liberated from that. You can feel the collective pain of this moment. Again, in researching this talk, I encountered this idea of radical Black joy. I also encountered this idea of racism as a multidisciplinary field, which was kind of going along with what I had been thinking about, that like, this is all kind of going the way it's supposed to, in that secondary trauma in response to current events is an intentional byproduct of systemic police violence, right? We think about like historic lynchings of like, let's hang this person up for everybody to see. That's supposed to send a message to Black people of like, this is what happens to you if you step out of line, or if, you know, you're just going about your day, right? So Black joy and Black mental health matters as much as Black lives do, and Black joy is an act of protest. And I close with, oops, I can't change the thing. Last slide. I close with the Audrey Lorde quote, that self-care is an act of political warfare. Thank you so much for your time, everyone, and have a safe rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you very much again, Dr. Cabral. We got one question here that somebody asked: are numbness and tingling also symptoms of the anxiety or physical symptoms we could be experiencing to trauma?
Yeah, I mean, you know, with trauma symptoms, I think that it can be so many things, and it can show up just like every individual human body is different. It can show up in different ways, especially if you notice this showing up, right around the time that, these videos were released and the news started to come out. I would encourage everyone to, if you're having, really sort of powerful physical symptoms that are really unclear and are alarming to you, definitely consult with a medical provider on those. Although, I would say that yes, there are a lot of different types of physical symptoms that can show up right now. And again, the way to address those is through self-care, is through disconnecting and unplugging, is like connecting with the things that make you a human being. Is what
Thank you again, Dr. Cabral. One question that comes up in my mind is the construct of vicarious trauma. And the thought that goes on in our heads is, am I next? Am I going to be the next one? Is this going to happen to me?
Yes.
So can you share with us about how should we respond if I'm in my apartment all by myself and I hear that there's somebody got shot 2 or 3 blocks away, and I start to panic and I start to think, how does that affect me as an adult? But more importantly, how does that affect a child who then thinks, is it safe for me to go outside? Every time I see a police officer, is he going to shoot me? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, Antoine, what you're describing is quite literally what happens, right? Whenever there's like community violence or police violence in your neighborhood or something, it's how could you not, right? Like, how could you not logically think to yourself, oh my God, what happens to me? What if I'm next? And to that, I would say that it is important to, and actually, my colleague and very good friend, Risha Gottlieb, is going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about how like our thoughts sort of play a role here. There are so many things in life that we can't control. So while it is, realistic to sort of to think about, I need to be vigilant and careful, maybe like with my child, or, and again, this is a message you would transmit to your child, in my community. There's also, to some degree, very little that you can do to prepare for something like a shooting or something like that. Again, we think to Breonna Taylor, who was like, what could Breonna Taylor do to prepare for something like that? And so it really, really is important to label this as valid anxiety, and then also do your best to distract, do your best to go about your day. The reason I can't answer your question that well is because the mental health paradigms and systems, again, assume safety and label thoughts like that as cognitive distortions. And that is just not true. Like that, it's because no, quite literally, something bad can happen to you. And so again, the way that the mental health community addresses that is that you're supposed to, like think strategically about, is what I'm thinking really true? Well, if you're a Black or brown person, yes, it is true, right? And so again, those distracting activities, being candid with children about, yeah, we're Black, and so things are scarier for us. Let's go color together.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Cabral. I think one of the things that I've heard you repeating a couple of times is the disconnect between mental health practice and theory. And one of the things I'm also really impressed by is that we have 4 mental health professionals of color on this panel. And I think one of the important things we need to really begin to understand is, if we want to talk about racism and race, we have to look at what does mental health theory and practice look like for people of color, which is significantly different than the white Western European Freudian psychoanalytical paradigm, which is what everybody is being trained under. And so it's a matter of stepping away from that framework and saying, how can my mental health practice or theory or implementation incorporate my culture, who the people I look like, so that it represents, so that everybody feels a more sense of inclusiveness. So thank you for that. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that I do, and I think it must be because I'm getting older, so there's lower testosterone, so I will cry more easily. But I play music and I dance and I sing. And I know my neighbors hate me when I sing because they're like, shoot him, please. Mm-hmm. And I cook. And I'm thinking to myself that some of the songs that I sing are so poignant that I can't even complete singing in my off-key voice because I collapse into tears.
Yeah.
Okay, and I play the song over and over again. Why? Because it resonates with me, but that's a way of me being able to expiate my feelings. So thank you again for that.
Of course.
Our next presenter is Dr. Gottlieb. Dr. Richard Gottlieb is a licensed clinical psychologist and the clinical director of New Perspective Psychological Services, one of the co-hosts for this morning for today's event. She received her doctoral degree from St. John's University, where her research fellowship focused on substance use and gender presentation in lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. She served as the director of behavioral health at Choices Women's Medical Center, where she helped to establish a department focused on providing behavioral health care as part of a holistic approach to women's health within a reproductive care center. She founded New Perspective Psychological Services, a group practice with a mission to provide evidence-based, culturally competent services to diverse communities and for clinicians who are adept at exploring racial, gender, and sexual identities and experiences of discrimination from cognitive and dialectical behavioral framework. Community members, I'd like to welcome Dr. Richard Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb.
Hi. Well, I'm here today as Dr. Gottlieb, but I'm also here today as Risha. I'm here today as somebody who is Haitian and Jewish, somebody who is queer and a parent, somebody who's deeply, deeply angry and sometimes feels quite helpless in the face of what is happening to Black and brown bodies. So I'm going to be talking to you today about a topic that I'm very familiar with: how to cope with guilt when there's always something more to be done, otherwise known as taking care of yourself when the world is on fire and there isn't a damn thing you can do to put it out. And to talk about this today, the first thing that we are going to do is something that sounds ridiculous. We're going to define what coping and guilt actually are. We're going to move into what healthy engagement in resistance is or could look like, and how to get out of some of the traps that guilt sets for us. First thing to know is that coping is not now and never will be a bubble bath. Coping and self-care have become diluted by capitalism and platitudes so that they have become synonymous with spend money on yourself, you deserve it, and just be nice to yourself. That is not what coping is. The word to cope, the root of that word, comes from the a root in Latin that means to cover, as in armor. If you are coping, you are mitigating what is assailing you. You are wearing armor. You are not having a good time. You're not relaxing. It doesn't feel great. Coping requires something of you. Coping requires consideration, thoughtfulness. And as part of that consideration, if you are a Black or a brown person, if you are a queer person, you have to consider how to decolonize your sense of self. And why that's so important is that we are told who we should be, what beauty is, and those images are not of ourselves. I can't say it better than Audrey Lorde could, and so I'm going to invoke her again. If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. If you are coping, you are unfurling so that you can't be eaten by it alive. The next thing to talk about is guilt. And I think about any negative emotion, anything that feels bad isn't necessarily bad. Redemptive guilt lets you know that you've acted in a way that violates your own values. It focuses on what you can do to not cause pain to others ever again. If you feel guilty, and this is for people listening now, and I know that we do have white participants as well. If you feel guilty about white privilege, that's a good thing. Don't do anything about it. Don't ask anybody else to do anything about it. Just feel guilty. You're supposed to. And that is all I'm going to say about redemptive guilt for the rest of this presentation. The rest of the time, we're going to be talking about non-redemptive guilt. Non-redemptive guilt comes from a place, comes from a foundation of unrealistic expectations that you place on yourself, society places on you, or maybe even the people who love you place on you. You can never meet those expectations. It fuels shame. I have not done enough because I am not enough. And it gets you to engage in self-flagellation, otherwise known as paralytic rumination. You think that you're atoning by thinking over and over and over again about what you've done wrong, but you're actually just stuck and fueling further sense of guilt and regret. Now, in coming up with this presentation, in really engaging in what it means to resist, and I'm going to define resistance broadly here. Resistance is coming to this presentation. Resistance is voting. Resistance is wearing a t-shirt that shows your own political views in a place where you're not sure how it's going to be received, otherwise known as the grocery store. So when we engage in resistance, we move through 3 different states of mind. And this is adapted from DBT. I'm a DBT and CBT practitioner. And we all engage in these states of mind at one time or another, but only dialectical engagement is something that is sustainable in the long term. That's what we're always striving towards, even if we're not always there. So when you're engaging in naive resistance, that is the part of you, of all of us, that says, we can work together to eliminate racism. And that's a beautiful thing. It is hopeful, it is energetic, it is purposeful. It also produces a deep sense of personal failure and guilt, as you will inevitably fail. Which reminds me of jaded engagement. That's where my mind has been much of this time. This country is always going to have racism. It always will have racism. It's been built on racism. F it. The pros, it acknowledges history. It acknowledges a desire, I think, that all people have for an in-group or an out-group, and us versus them. But it also really fosters a deep, deep sense of hopelessness and helplessness and resentment and disconnection that isn't a place that you want to live or bathe in. So dialectical engagement. A dialectic is something that holds 2 concepts that sound like they should cancel each other out as equally true at the same time. And in holding both of those truths, you create something that is larger than either of them separately. Racism will never be eliminated, and my resistance is meaningful. If I can get to a place where on most days, I and you can accept that as true, well, then you can let go of guilt and shame because you no longer have unrealistic expectations while holding on to hope. If you can radically accept that you will never be able to do enough, maybe you can accept that you can be enough. I want to share with you a dialectical statement that is meaningful to me. I am fighting the same fight that my ancestors fought. And the road that I walk while I do so is not the same path that they walked before me, even if it passes through the same trees, the same crags, the same cliffs. It is a disservice to my grandparents, my ancestors, to every great grand other that I will never meet or know about, to say that their fight didn't lay down gravel on the path that I am currently walking. Which brings me to a trap. Guilt, non-redemptive guilt, traps you. And here's guilt trap number one. I'm not currently in the streets, so I'm not an activist. I am not engaged. I'm not in the resistance. Who's thought that? Guilt trap number two. I should have called out or educated Karen. That regret that sits with you. Guilt trap number three. I have not given every inch of myself to the movement, so I'm not in it. Guilt trap number four. I'm lazy because I've gotten nothing done all day. Guys, can I tell you about the Netflix I have been watching? It has been glorious, mindless sci-fi. And you know what? Sometimes I look at the clock and it's 5 hours later and I don't even know how that happened. So coping statements. This is what I tell myself when all those traps are around my ankle, weighing down on my back. Living my life is enough. I do not owe anyone an explanation, education. They are not currently paying me for my wisdom. So if I give it, I choose to give it. And if not, me living my life is the education that they should be paying attention to. Self-compassion is not self-indulgent. There is a difference. I do not have to align with my everyday life with struggle on the inside to align my life with struggle on the outside. I can align myself with grace and with ease. And let me tell you, when I think about grace, I think about unearned latitude that we all have. We didn't do anything to deserve it, and nobody can take it from you. We don't need or want, and this is mine, this is the one that really sits with me and I tell myself over and over and over again. We don't need or want another martyr who died young. We carry stress in our bodies. So if I carry guilt, I will die young. I will age into my wisdom. I will guard my energy so that I can teach the next generation how to live with conviction, grace, and playfulness. And the last thing I want to talk about is how to conquer paralytic guilt. Again, you're going to see me fall back on my background as a DBT therapist and talk to you about how to get to your wise mind to get through this. You know what? If you genuinely feel guilty that you should be doing more, do more. But use your wise mind to figure out what that means for you. Okay. You're going to notice a diagram that looks very familiar. I've been told by a lot of my clients that I like circles. That's the best way that I present information, and they're right. So emotion mind is that part of all of us that is mood dependent, reactive, and impulsive, whereas logic mind, and don't be seduced by the word logic here. Logic sounds good, but it's a trap. Rational, deliberate, and pragmatic, that is the part of you that reads 30 reviews before buying a set of curtains. And you don't even know how like 15 hours went into that kind of research. So your wise mind lives in between those two. Your wise mind necessarily includes your emotions and facts. It is values driven, it is personality driven, it is driven by your history, it acknowledges your personal wisdom and the wisdom of others. Okay, well, that's very nice, but how do you get there? So here are some questions that you can ask yourself right now to help you reach your wise mind. When I'm thinking about my emotions, will I carry resentment towards myself or others if I do or do not follow through the action I am considering? Is the action that I'm considering something that I've been thinking about for a while and mulling over? Or is it the kind of thing that pops up into my head and feels so pressing Then I take my logic brain. What is the likelihood that my actions will result in serious harm for myself or for the people in my household? Health, loss of income, loss of a caregiver? And only you answering those questions together can I come up with my wise mind. And you'll notice that that's blank, because everybody's wise mind will tell them something different. Now, my emotion mind has been telling me to be in the streets, but my logic mind knows that I'm a parent of an infant whose health is the most important thing in my life. So in the context of COVID-19, I just can't be there. And my wise mind brought me here today. While non-redemptive guilt is brittle, your wise mind is flexible. Use flexible thinking in a number of different ways to resolve these problems. I can't, whatever, because whatever. I can't be in the street and protest because I have an infant and parenting that infant is my first priority. All right, so if I'm going to think flexibly, here's what I do. Can I remove the thing that's blocking me from getting in the streets? I can't. I'm a parent now and I always will be. Can I reprioritize things so the consequences are acceptable if they do occur? Not in this situation. Risking my son's health isn't worth it. Flexible thinking, can I do something else? Yes. Yes, I can. Here's where I can resolve this for myself. And I can't do something else without making that something else worthy, without making this worthwhile. So this has been worthwhile for me, and I hope that what I had to say has been worthwhile for you. I hope that you use what we've said today to nourish yourself and to take care of yourself. In thinking about the ways in which I personally have been coping, I must say that putting together my thoughts as well as my presentation has been a coping skill of mine. But you know what? So has trying to leave the house every day, not being mad at myself when I don't have time to exercise, reading books by Black authors that are not about racism and slavery. So I don't know if those skills will help you, but they certainly help me. Thank you so much for being a part of this. The next slides are not slides I'm going to read, but after this you will see some resources that you can use for yourself. Antoine?
Yes, thank you very much again, Dr. Gottlieb. So we have at least a question from Kevin, who has asked, do you have any recommendations for individuals who are interested in entering into therapy, psychological mental health world as a licensed clinician and interested in being a dissent voice in clinical spaces to better represent my communities, but also help to, as you said, decolonize the practice? And he just commented that Dr. Cabral mentioned that the psychoanalytical paradigms are overwhelmingly white. Mm-hmm. Just curious if you have any pieces of advice you would give, given yourself when you enter the space, but really for me, because time doesn't work like that. So maybe any of you can jump in and answer the second part, but I think the first part is for you, Dr. Gottlieb.
Sure. Well, first thing is do it. Become a clinician and put yourself in a space in which you can serve your community. Also, be guarded that some of those spaces may try to take advantage of you. And if you find that, find a different space. That goes back to some places do kind of sell you the idea that if you haven't given all of yourself to the movement, then you haven't been a good enough therapist, and that is false. So the second thing that you're asking about is how to decolonize your practice. And if you're asking for a specific paradigm, the truth is right now there isn't a specific paradigm that I can share with you. But what I do is I really think critically about the paradigms that I practice under and highlight for myself, for my clients, and hopefully for you, some of the ways in which they need to be tweaked. Cynthia brought up the idea that they're predicated on abuse stopping. Racism is the ultimate abuse and it will not stop. It is the ultimate invalidation, like Thomas said, and it will not stop. So I can't base my practice on the idea that you will be safe from racism and I should help you check the facts on that. Instead of checking the facts, what I should be doing is validate and ask you, what is your life worth living given the options you have before you? And instilling the idea that you can have a life worth living in the face of racism.
Yeah, I think Risha responded to that so beautifully. And I don't have that much to add, except to say that if you are a therapist of color who thinks critically about how to apply, the behavioral interventions and the analytic techniques that we are taught, and you do so in a critical way while working with clients of color, you are decolonizing the practice. Congratulations. That's all that's needed, right? Like, what that means for me is that I will frequently go off script and I will say, look, this is what we have to work with. This is how this may or may not apply to you. And just that open acknowledgement of like, we might need to like work extra hard together to find something that works, because right now I don't have that many tools for you and I'm so sorry. So yeah, that is what I would say there.
I definitely agree with everything that Risha and Cynthia said, beautifully stated. The only thing I would add is just to make sure you kind of create spaces, especially as a clinician of color, where you're connecting with other clinicians of color, other people involved in the mental health field. There's so many people, along the way that like helped me with the journey. From one of my mentors, Auntie Pat, who really, encouraged me, to enter, into a graduate program. To the unofficial Black Girls Club that we formed at our graduate program, and to people that I've met, after, graduating, like Risha and, then people, that I'm meeting through this forum. So I definitely think to kind of create a space where you're connecting with other clinicians of color or people who are doing similar work, even if they're not a clinician.
Thank you. Kitama, do you want to add to this? You have to unmute.
Thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. I think the most important piece is to identify your values before going into it. So, because every therapist has different reasons for going into it, as I'm sure anyone who's been in therapy or met a therapist has realized. And it's so important to work places that align with your values, or where you settle down to align with your values. I think every clinician of color has worked places that did not fully align with their values, even if what they were personally doing did.
And even if they told you that they did.
Oh yeah, they all tell you they do. So it's so important to find that place that is going to provide, for my values, high quality therapy that is accessible and is affordable. Because for anyone who has gone to a community clinic, it is challenging to find a therapist who has the support that they need, the training they need, and a caseload size where they can actually be there for you as a patient. Because they're not going to do it if they have 200 patients. We just can't. So figure out what your values are, how you can reach that community, and make sure everything you do sticks to those values.